Grace Taylor didn't usually put much stock in routine medical visits. Hospitals unsettled her. The quiet hum of machines, the echoing hallways, the faint smell of antiseptic that clung to the air like a warning. But something about the last few weeks had shaken her enough to make an appointment she would have otherwise ignored. The exhaustion no longer faded after a good night's sleep. The dizziness came at random, often when she was simply standing still. Her body felt like it was waving a white flag, and even though she hated the vulnerability that came with being a patient, she couldn't keep pretending it was nothing. The Parkview Wellness Center was nothing like the hospitals she remembered from back home in Ohio. It was sleek, modern, and quiet, almost too perfect. Polished white walls, glass panels, and soft jazz playing faintly through hidden speakers. It felt more like a high-end spa than a clinic. She felt out of place, a little too ordinary for the gleam and shine of it all. Still, she checked in, gave her name, Grace Taylor, and followed the nurse to a private room. Inside, she sat on the edge of the exam table, wrapped in a paper gown, legs dangling, trying not to fidget. She hadn't told anyone she was coming here. In fact, no one in New York really knew her at all. That was part of the plan. 6 months ago, she had left behind a life full of memories she didn't want to carry anymore. An engagement that crumbled days before the wedding, a mother gone too soon in a car crash, and the kind of grief that left her hollow. She came to New York to escape, to start over. But some things followed you no matter how far you ran. A soft knock at the door made her flinch. "Grace Taylor?" A man's voice called gently from the other side. "Yes," she answered, trying to sound steadier than she felt. The door opened, and a man in navy scrubs and a white coat stepped inside. He was tall, lean, with dark hair and a quiet strength about him. His face was handsome but serious, his eyes a deep steel gray that seemed to notice everything. He looked up from the clipboard and offered her a small, genuine smile. "I'm Dr. Sam Bennett," he said. "I'll be handling your wellness check today." Grace nodded, her voice catching in her throat. "Hi." He moved with calm confidence, asking a few initial questions while noting her answers, his tone both professional and kind. As he gestured for her to lie back so he could check her vitals, she tried to stay calm. It was just a checkup, nothing to worry about. "Any history of fainting spells?" he asked, placing the stethoscope gently against her chest. She shook her head. "Number just tired. Dizzy sometimes." His brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't press. She closed her eyes as he listened. The room suddenly felt warmer, her limbs heavier. Her breath slowed as if her body was pulling her away. "Grace?" His voice grew more distant. "Grace, stay with me." Darkness swept over her. The next thing she felt was pressure, steady hands against her back, an arm supporting her head, a voice anchoring her to the moment. "Grace, can you hear me? Don't try to move just yet. You fainted." Her eyes fluttered open. The light above her seemed to shimmer, and there he was, Dr. Bennett, his eyes filled with concern, his tone firm but gentle. "Did I pass out?" she whispered. He gave a short laugh of relief. "You did. Classic vasovagal response. Probably low blood sugar and exhaustion." She blinked, realizing her head was still resting against his arm, his hand warm against her shoulder. The scent of clean cotton and something faintly citrusy clung to him. She flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry. That must have been dramatic." "You wouldn't believe how often it happens," he said with a soft smile. "But you're the first to faint into my arms." Despite herself, she let out a breathy laugh. In that small moment, her cheeks red, her body shaky, her heart racing, Grace felt something strange and unfamiliar. Not fear, not shame, but a flicker of safety, a quiet moment in the middle of chaos. And even though she didn't know it yet, something had shifted. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something honest, something real. In the minutes that followed her fainting spell, Grace found herself seated back on the exam table, sipping from a small paper cup filled with juice. Dr. Sam Bennett hadn't left her side once. Instead of calling in a nurse or stepping out to resume his schedule, he remained in the room, relaxed, attentive, and quietly present. It wasn't the behavior she expected from a doctor at a high-end wellness center, and it certainly wasn't something she was used to. "You really don't have to stay," Grace murmured, her voice still laced with embarrassment. Sam looked up from his stool, where he sat with one leg crossed over the other. And yet here I am. She gave a soft, self-deprecating chuckle. You probably have a dozen patients waiting who aren't passing out in your arms. Today, he said with a light smile, I'm only concerned about the one who did. His tone was calm, matter of fact, but his eyes, those steady gray eyes, held something else. Not flirtation, not detached professionalism. Something quieter. Something that felt like care without condition, and it made Grace's breath catch for a moment longer than she expected. He eventually stood to retrieve a cold pack and gently placed it behind her neck. Low blood sugar and stress don't mix well. Have you eaten today? She hesitated. Just coffee. Sam raised an eyebrow, not in judgment, but concern. That's not breakfast. I didn't think I'd pass out, she muttered, cheeks pinking again. No one ever does. There was no scolding in his voice, no lecture, just understanding, the kind that didn't require explanation. Grace looked down at her hands wrapped around the cup. She didn't know how to describe the feeling, but it was as if the very act of being noticed so gently was enough to crack something open inside her. Do you live alone? He asked quietly, not intrusively. She nodded. I moved here a few months ago. Don't really know anyone yet. You're not alone right now, he said simply. The words, so plain on the surface, landed with surprising weight. She didn't respond, not immediately, but she felt it, that tightening in her chest that came when someone saw past the armor. When the nurse peeked her head in to inform Dr. Bennett that his 2 o'clock patient had arrived, he glanced at the clock, then back at Grace. I'll be there in 15, he said gently. The nurse blinked, a little surprised, but nodded and stepped away. Grace looked at him, eyebrows raised. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to, he replied. Sometimes the people who look like they need the least help actually need it the most. She didn't argue. She didn't know how. A few moments passed in silence. Then he said, let me guess. You're trying to prove something. Working hard, skipping meals, pretending everything's fine. Grace gave a startled laugh. You always this observant? He shrugged. Hazard of the job, but also, I've been there. She tilted her head slightly, studying him for the first time. Not as her doctor, but as a person. Someone who understood exhaustion, not just from medical training, but maybe from life. You don't seem like someone who gets overwhelmed easily, she said. I've had my moments, he replied, the faintest flicker of memory passing over his expression. She didn't press, but she wondered. What story lived behind his calm exterior? What had shaped him into someone who stayed longer than he had to, who noticed more than most, but never made her feel small for needing help? Rest here a little longer before standing, he said as he moved toward the sink to wash his hands. I'll have someone bring you a protein bar. You're stable now, but I want you to recover slowly. Grace nodded, murmuring, Thank you. For everything. He dried his hands, then turned to face her, his voice soft. It's my job. No, she said, meeting his gaze. It's more than that. Their eyes held for a beat too long, and then, as if they both realized it at once, the moment broke with a small smile from him. Well, he said, don't tell anyone. I've got a reputation for being emotionally unavailable. That made her laugh, really laugh, for the first time in what felt like weeks. After he stepped out, the room felt different, not cold, not sterile, but quiet in a comforting way. Grace leaned back against the exam table, staring at the ceiling. Her heart still fluttered, but not from low blood sugar this time. Across the city, Dr. Sam Bennett returned to his office and sat for a long moment, staring at the framed photograph on his desk. His mother stood smiling in her backyard garden, dirt on her hands, a scarf wrapped over her head. She had died 10 years ago during a routine surgery, an allergic reaction no one caught. One missed note on a chart, one simple mistake that cost everything. He had been in business school at the time, following the family legacy, but that loss changed him. He walked away from wealth and shareholders and quarterly earnings and chose medic. Grace didn't expect to see Dr. Sam Bennett again, not in any real personal sense. She had replayed the morning of her fainting spell more times than she cared to admit. His calm voice, the way he caught her, the quiet patience in his eyes. But doctors didn't remember patience like her. She was sure of that. What had happened in the exam room, she told herself, was simply a good physician doing his job with decency and care. 3 weeks passed. Life resumed its rhythm, fast, gray, anonymous. The city didn't pause for anyone's inner struggles, and Grace, as always, adapted. She made it to work. She answered emails. She remembered to eat, most days. But something lingered under the surface, a weight she hadn't felt before, or perhaps one she could no longer ignore. Then came her follow-up appointment, scheduled, routine, unremarkable on the calendar. But when she walked through the glass doors of Parkview Wellness Center again, her heart picked up pace in a way she hadn't expected. She blamed it on the coffee. The waiting room was quiet, filled with the soft shuffling of magazines and distant keyboard taps. She barely had time to check in before she heard a voice. Familiar, steady, somehow warmer than the rest of the sterile space. Grace Taylor. She looked up. Dr. Sam Bennett stood at the reception desk, a clipboard in hand, navy scrubs slightly wrinkled, like he'd been on his feet all day. His gaze landed on her and his face lit up, not dramatically, but with something unmistakably real. "You remember my name?" she asked, surprised before she could filter it. He walked over, a smile tugging gently at his lips. "It's not every day someone calls me an angel and faints into my arms." She laughed, flushed. "Right, that. How have you been feeling?" "Better," she said. "Eating real food, sleeping sometimes, still a little dizzy, but only when handsome doctors walk into the room unexpectedly." He raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Glad to see your sense of humor survived." Before she could say more, a nurse called her name for the appointment. Sam glanced down at the clipboard, then back at her. "Looks like I'm handling your follow-up," he said with a wink. In the exam room, the atmosphere was different this time. Lighter, familiar. He moved through the motions of the checkup with quiet precision, asking questions, updating her chart, checking her vitals. But between the clinical necessities, there was conversation. Real conversation. They talked about bagels and subway delays, about how hard it was to figure out which neighborhoods felt like home, about how the quiet in New York was different, not silence, but distance. And something about the way Sam listened, genuinely, attentively, made Grace feel less like a patient and more like herself. Then as she hopped down from the table, she winced and placed a hand over her lower abdomen. "You okay?" he asked, instantly alert. "Just a cramp. Probably something I ate," she said quickly, brushing it off. He didn't look convinced. "Let's run a few quick tests to be sure." "I don't want to throw off your schedule." "They'll wait," he said simply, already helping her out the door. They moved together through the clinic halls, not rushed, not tense. During pauses for labs and imaging, they talked more about work, about why she left Ohio, about how she still hadn't figured out how to get through a city intersection without accidentally making eye contact with a taxi. And Sam, he surprised her. He told her about his first year of med school, how he once confused the neurology wing with the cafeteria and wandered into the wrong rotation entirely. He shared pieces of himself not as credentials, but as a person. It wasn't polished, it was honest. Somewhere between the blood draw and the ultrasound, something shifted. Grace could feel it, not just in the way he stood a little closer, or how his voice softened when she mentioned her mother, but in the silences. They weren't awkward, they were full of space and warmth. As they waited for results in a quiet consultation room, she looked at him and said softly, "Thank you." "For what?" "For treating me like I matter." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and for the first time, his expression lost its careful professionalism. "You do matter, Grace. A lot more than you think." She didn't know what to say to that. The words landed too deeply to brush off with sarcasm. She looked down, feeling that familiar sting behind her eyes, the one that came when someone was unexpectedly kind. Later, as they stepped outside into the early evening, he held the door open for her. "Everything looks normal. Mild inflammation, likely stress-related," he said. "Nothing serious." Grace exhaled in relief. "I was half convinced I had something rare and incurable." "If you did," he teased, "I'd name it after you." She laughed despite herself. Great. I've always wanted my own disease. They stood for a moment outside the clinic doors, where the hum of traffic and city life swirled around them. Sam gestured toward the cafe across the street. "Can I buy you a coffee?" he asked casually. "No lab coats, just coffee." Grace hesitated. The invitation was simple, unthreatening, but something old inside her, a voice shaped by past betrayals, whispered, "Don't." "Thanks, but I should get home," she said quickly. He didn't push, just nodded, with that same calm patience she was starting to associate with him. "Some other time, maybe." That night she couldn't sleep. His voice echoed in her memory. "You do matter." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a declaration. But it felt like the beginning of a door opening, quietly, slowly, and for the first time in a long time, Grace considered the possibility of stepping through. Grace hadn't meant to overhear the conversation. She had stopped by Parkview Wellness Center a few days later. Nothing dramatic, just to drop off an insurance form at the administrative office. The errand was simple, forgettable. She hadn't even checked to see if Dr. Bennett was scheduled that day. In fact, she told herself she didn't care either way. But as she passed by a quiet hallway just off the main corridor, she heard his voice. Familiar, steady, except this time, it didn't sound like it was meant for her. "She's lovely," a woman said with a soft chuckle. "Her father's on the hospital board. You'd be insane not to give it a chance." "I'm not looking to get serious with anyone right now," Sam replied. His voice was calm, maybe even tired. Grace froze, her hand tightening on the folder she held. "I mean it," he continued. "I've got enough on my plate, and honestly, I just don't want to go down that road." The hallway suddenly felt colder, more distant. She didn't wait to hear the rest. She turned quickly, retracing her steps and exiting the building with her heartbeat thudding too loudly in her ears. That night, Sam texted her like usual. "Sam, long day. Miss our late-night chats. You okay?" She stared at the message, and for the first time since that awkward juice cup and cold pack in the exam room, she didn't answer. 2 days passed, then 3. No messages, no calls, no explanation. Grace buried herself in work, but her focus frayed. She told herself it was nothing, just a doctor being polite, just casual conversations she had blown out of proportion. But deep down, it stung more than she wanted to admit, because she had let herself believe in something. Not love, not yet, but the fragile start of something kind. And now, every gentle moment, the coffee invitation, the lingering glances, the way he had said, "You matter," felt like a story she had made up in her head. Had it only been kindness? Had she confused care for something more? When her friend Diana stopped by her apartment later that week, Grace tried to act normal. They sipped tea on the couch, flipping through an old cookbook neither of them had any intention of using. But eventually Diana asked, "So, how's your doctor?" Grace gave a short laugh and shrugged. "Busy, I guess." "Or, you're hiding something." Grace hesitated. "I heard him talking to someone. He said he didn't want anything serious right now. Not looking." Diana raised an eyebrow. "Was he talking about you?" "I don't know," Grace admitted. "Probably not. But it felt like it." "Did you ask?" "No." "Grace." "I didn't want to hear the answer," she whispered, "because I already knew how that story ends." Diana didn't argue. She simply reached over, placing a warm hand on Grace's. "Just don't let one shadow keep you from stepping into the light, okay?" Across the city, Dr. Sam Bennett sat in his office, staring at the same unopened email draft for the 3rd time that week. He had noticed her silence immediately. Grace wasn't the kind of person who ghosted people. She was thoughtful, responsive, honest. He didn't need to be told something had shifted. He could feel it. He went over the last few messages, replayed every interaction, and when he couldn't stand it anymore, he called the front desk. "Has Grace Taylor rescheduled her follow-up?" The receptionist hesitated. "No, doctor." "Bennett. She just didn't show." He hung up slowly, tapping the edge of his pen against the desk. It wasn't disappointment he felt. It was something deeper. A quiet ache, the kind that whispered, "You lost something good, and you don't even know why." Later that afternoon, Grace stood at a crosswalk, watching the city move around her. Horns blared, steam curled up from manholes, and the winter wind slid beneath her coat. But inside, it wasn't the cold that made her shiver. It was the sudden rush of unshed tears pressing against her ribs. She had let herself hope, and now she was mourning something she never even had the courage to name out loud. She didn't want to be the woman who crumbled over a misunderstanding. She had survived worse. But still, this cut her in a way she didn't expect. Not because he left, but because she walked away first, before he could. That kind of fear had a name, self-protection. But sometimes it felt a lot like loneliness. Back at the clinic, Sam stared out the window of his office as evening settled over the city. The lights shifted on the skyline, soft and golden, and he thought of her. How she looked when she smiled. How she covered her nervousness with sarcasm. How she lingered in his thoughts more than she ever should have. He didn't know what had happened, but he knew one thing for certain. He missed her. And that mattered more than anything else. Sam Bennett wasn't a man who chased shadows. He was calm by nature, measured, known among colleagues for his quiet steadiness, even in crisis. But the silence between him and Grace wasn't a typical storm he could ride out. It felt different, like something essential had slipped through his fingers, and he didn't even know what caused it. He had left messages, just enough to reach for her, not enough to pressure her, but they remained unanswered. And though no promises had ever been exchanged between them, no labels, no lines drawn, he felt the absence of her more keenly than made sense. It wasn't about pride anymore. It was about regret. So that Friday afternoon, after canceling his final meeting for the day, Sam walked into the lobby of a mid-sized design firm on the east side. He didn't call ahead. He didn't write another message. He simply walked in, coat collar turned up against the wind, hands shoved into his pockets, and an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. The receptionist, a young woman with bright glasses and a confused smile, blinked at him. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Grace Taylor." "She's in a meeting." "That's okay," he said quietly. "I'll wait." He sat on the low bench by the window, watching cars pass and people rush by. Everything outside moved quickly, but inside him, everything had slowed. When Grace finally stepped into the lobby, her stride faltered the moment she saw him. She hadn't expected this. Her first instinct was to turn around, but something rooted her in place, something heavier than surprise. Maybe it was the fact that he looked so familiar, or maybe it was the fact that part of her had been hoping he'd come, even when she told herself he wouldn't. He stood slowly. "Grace." Her voice was careful, neutral. "Sam." They stood there for a long beat. No script, no small talk, just silence filled with everything they hadn't said. "I know you don't owe me anything," Sam began softly, "and I promise I won't keep you long. But I needed to say something, and I couldn't do it through a screen." She didn't move, but she didn't leave. That was enough for him to go on. "That day, the conversation you overheard," he said, "it wasn't about you." Grace looked down, arms crossed, her face unreadable, but her eyes softer than they had been. "I was being pressured into a setup," he continued. "A friend of the family. It was political, not personal. I told them I wasn't looking for anything serious, because I didn't want to be pushed into something I didn't choose." He exhaled slowly. "But what I didn't realize is how that sounded, and I hate that it made you feel like you didn't matter." She still didn't speak. The lobby was too quiet, the air between them too charged. "I should have told you sooner," he added, "but I didn't think I had to. I didn't think it mattered yet." Her eyes met his then, steady, searching. "It wasn't just the words, Sam. It's what I thought they confirmed." He nodded, his voice low. "I know." Another silence stretched between them, heavy but not hostile. She was still listening, and that to Sam was the beginning of hope. "I don't know exactly what this is between us," he said honestly, "but it matters to me. You matter to me. And if there's any part of you that wants to keep walking forward, I'll be right here." Grace looked down at the floor, then slowly back up at him, her expression unreadable, but her voice when it came was soft. "I don't know either," she admitted, "but I haven't stopped thinking about it." Sam felt his breath catch, not in shock, but in relief. She hadn't closed the door entirely. She took a small step forward. "I wasn't just scared of what you said. I was scared of what I was starting to feel." His gaze held hers. "Me too." And that was the truth of it. Neither of them had asked for this. Neither of them had expected something meaningful to grow out of a fainting spell in a paper gown. But it had, quietly, steadily. In between checkups and jokes about coffee, Grace gave a faint nod and turned toward the hallway, her hands still wrapped tightly around her own elbows. But before she walked away, she paused. "You're not wrong, you know," she said without looking back. "About what? Sometimes the people who look like they need the least help need it the most." And then she disappeared down the corridor, leaving Sam alone in the lobby. He didn't follow. He didn't need to, because later that night, just before midnight, his phone buzzed softly on the kitchen counter. "Grace, I'm ready to hear more, if you still want to tell it." Sam didn't reply right away. He just stared at the message, a quiet smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. Not everything had to be rushed. Sometimes the bravest thing was simply staying open. And now, for the first time, the door between them stood not halfway shut, but slightly ajar. They met the next afternoon in Central Park. No white coats, no exam tables, just a bench beneath bare winter trees, their breath curling into the cold air. Sam brought coffee in a cardboard tray. Grace brought the gloves she rarely wore, the ones her mother had knitted the year before she passed. Somehow, the old wool felt right for this moment. Familiar, grounding. They didn't speak at first. The silence was comfortable now, not heavy. Around them, the world moved in its usual rhythm, children laughing in the distance, a dog barking at pigeons, the soft crunch of snow beneath boots. "I missed this," Sam said quietly. "Me too," Grace replied, her voice barely above a whisper. What followed wasn't a grand reconciliation. There were no speeches, no sweeping declarations. Just truth, spoken in fragments, offered without defense. Grace told him how she'd spent years trying to make herself smaller, how she believed if she just stayed quiet, stayed useful, she'd be safe from disappointment, from loss. Sam told her how he'd built walls behind his smile, how the memory of his mother's death had shaped not only his career, but his reluctance to open himself again to something he couldn't control, like love. "I got used to being needed for what I could do," he said, "not for who I was." Grace looked at him for a long moment, then gently reached for his hand. Their fingers laced together like they had always known how. "I don't need you to be perfect, Sam," she said softly. "I just need you to be here." He nodded, his voice a low hum in the cold air. "I'm here." And that was enough. From that day forward, things didn't change all at once. They didn't rush into titles or force the shape of a relationship. They simply kept showing up. Coffee turned into lunch. Lunch turned into quiet Sunday walks. Texts became calls. And soon their lives began to fold into one another, not with noise, but with intention. A year later, Grace stood in the lobby of Parkview Wellness Center, not as a patient, but as a co-organizer for the clinic's first community health day. She held a clipboard in one hand, her other hand waving gently at volunteers, staff, and grateful neighbors who had come for free checkups and flu shots. It was Sam's idea, but it had become their project. Across the room, he caught her eye. Still in his scrubs, sleeves rolled, stethoscope draped around his neck. He looked tired, but his smile was real, anchored, proud. As the final patient left, he walked over and brushed imaginary dust from her shoulder. "You survived," he teased. "Barely," she grinned. "My feet may never forgive me." "I have a cure for that." She raised an eyebrow. "Does it involve actual medicine?" "Absolutely not," he said, reaching for her hand. "Come with me." He led her down the hallway, past rooms now filled with memories. At the end of the hall, he paused in front of exam room 3. "Do you remember this room?" he asked. Grace smiled. "Where I called you an angel and fainted in your arms?" "Vaguely." He chuckled and opened the door. Inside, the lights were dimmed. A small bouquet of white peonies, her favorite, rested on the counter. And on the exam table, where she once lay unconscious, was a small velvet box. Grace froze. Sam turned to her. voice low, steady. "The first time I saw you in this room, I didn't know your name. I didn't know your story. But I remember thinking, if I ever had the chance to keep you safe, I wouldn't let it slip away." He opened the box. Inside was a simple, elegant gold ring. "I don't need perfect," he said. "I just need real. I need you. Will you marry me?" Grace's eyes filled with tears. She nodded, laughing softly through them. "Yes, of course, yes." They didn't rush the kiss. They stood forehead to forehead, letting the moment settle around them. Not doctor and patient, not broken and trying, just two people, still healing, still human, who had found home in each other. As we grow older, we often carry with us a quiet collection of invisible wounds, losses we never expected, betrayals that changed how we trust, and chapters of our lives we rarely speak of. Grace Taylor's story reminds us that even after life has cracked us open, it's still possible to find healing in places we least expect, like an exam room, a soft voice, or a steady hand that doesn't let go. One of the most powerful lessons from her journey with Dr. Sam Bennett is this: healing doesn't always come from dramatic changes. Sometimes it begins with being seen, not for the image we present to the world, but for the truth we carry quietly inside. Grace didn't set out to fall in love. She was simply trying to survive. But through small, consistent acts of kindness, she was reminded of her worth. And perhaps more importantly, she allowed herself to believe it again. For older adults, many of whom have spent decades caring for others, managing responsibilities, or recovering from personal loss, this story offers something deeply affirming. It's never too late to be chosen, not out of obligation, but out of love. We often protect ourselves by staying silent, keeping our hearts guarded, convinced we've missed our moment. But as Grace and Sam show us, some of life's most meaningful connections don't happen in our prime. They happen when we least expect them, when we're honest, open, and brave enough to try again. The lesson is simple but profound. Don't close the door on your own heart too soon. Healing is a quiet process. Love in its truest form isn't loud or perfect. It's patient, steady, and real. So whether you're 35 or 75, may this story remind you that your best days are never behind you. Sometimes they begin the moment you let someone in.